Just dump all 9 kids on her. That was my son's plan for Christmas, and I heard every word. I stood behind the cracked laundry room door, hands wet with dish soap, cinnamon and pine in the air. The tree lights blinked in the window. "It's a wonderful life," murmured on mute, and my heart hammered. "She won't say no. She never does," he chuckled, the dryer humming like it agreed. Humiliation burned up my throat, but under it, something steadier clicked into place. By the time the rinse cycle ended, I had a different Christmas in mind. 2 days later, the driveway glowed with exhaust as a Buick and a minivan idled under a gray Ohio sky. 9 little parkas spilled out, boots thudding salt onto my porch. I stepped out with my suitcase. "My name is Margaret. I'm 68, and that morning my voice did not shake. I set a plastic bin of their stockings in my son's hands and met his eyes. "Christmas at Grandma's is canceled," I said, locking the storm door. "And so is using me." The church bells down the block started noon, like they were backing me up. He laughed, then saw I wasn't joking. The laugh dried, leaving a flush and a twitching jaw. Carols leaked from his dashboard. The neighbor's inflatable Santa keeled in the wind, and I breathed easy. I had booked a quiet cabin by Hocking Hills, a jigsaw puzzle in my tote, and peace on purpose. The ham was in the freezer, the lights on a timer, and my phone set to Do Not Disturb. "We'll figure our own Christmas," I added, tucking the spare key into my pocket like a medal. The kids stared at me, then at their father. For once, the decision was his, not mine. You want to know what years of sure honey and last-minute rescues do to a family at Christmas? I'll tell you how a church-going grandmother got pushed to this porch, and why I finally pushed back. How I overheard that plan, traced the pattern back to diaper days, and rewrote my holiday playbook. If you believe boundaries are a gift you give with love, subscribe to hear the rest of my story. Maybe you'll recognize your own December in mine and find the courage to change your plan too. I kept my hand on the storm door a moment longer than I needed to, feeling the cold through the brass and the familiar give of the latch under my palm. The bells at St. Michael's finished their noon count and swung into "O Come All Ye Faithful" with the same sturdy cheer they've had since I was a girl, and for the first time in years I let them sing over me without thinking about whether the rolls were rising or the cider needed warming. My son's eyes searched my face for a crack, a soft spot he could press with a joke or an old memory. There was a time when the sound of his voice could make me drop anything. That day, I had my suitcase, a plastic bin of stockings, and the knowledge that my yeses had grown wild and needed pruning. My name is Margaret. Most people call me Mrs. Hanlon at church or Maggie at the library, but my family has always said Mom and then Grandma, like a bell that summons help. I am 68 years old, a widow for 9 winters, a woman whose freezer has seen more ham than a deli. The man fidgeting on my porch was my oldest, David. He has his father's height and the same way of rubbing his jaw when he's embarrassed, though Robert never learned to weaponize that charm. David had orchestrated this year's Christmas like a general laying out maps. Who would be where? Who would pick up what? What would be handed to me and when, as if I were a counter that never moved. "Just dump all 9 kids on her," he'd said into his phone 2 nights earlier, the dryer humming yes like a second conspirator. He is a good man in many ways, generous when it's easy, funny when it helps. But when it comes to me, he has slipped too easily into a rhythm that makes me the spare wheel on his car, pulled out when a tire blows, expected to roll. "I'll call you," he muttered to the air now, but not to me. The kids shuffled on the porch like a small herd, eyes bright, cheeks red from the wind, boots stamping the salt into melting halos. Addie's hat with the pink pom-pom, Benny's navy blue parka, Leah with her lopsided braids. My heart knew each of them as well as the creak on the 6th step and the way the kitchen window fogs when the kettle boils. I bent, I couldn't help it, and took Leah's mittened hands. "You'll have your own special Christmas," I told her, and I meant it. "Your dad is going to come up with something great." She nodded, trusting children do it naturally, though her eyes flicked to the minivan with that question all grandchildren have about adult choices. I kissed her hat, that sweet wool and snow smell, and then I put my spare key in my pocket like a medal pinned after a long campaign. I locked the storm door, turned the deadbolt, and lifted my suitcase down the steps. The neighbor's inflatable Santa keeled again and bumped the ash tree like a tipsy oath. David laughed once, reflexive, then stopped. He hooked a thumb at the Buick. "You serious?" he said. He made it a statement, as if testing the word. "I am," I replied. I won't pretend I didn't feel the wobble inside, the old guilt ready to throw itself across the path of a new choice. But that day, the steadier thing took the wheel. I slid my suitcase into the trunk of my car, my own little sedan that smells faintly of peppermint, because I keep a bag of mints for the kids and forget them for months. The back seat held a folded sweater, the jigsaw puzzle with foxes in the snow, a church cookbook with a recipe for peanut butter buckeyes from Mrs. Raines, who has made the same treats every December since 1974. I had planned my quiet like a person plans a pilgrimage, carefully, thoughtfully, with an eye for the small things that make a day. As I pulled away, the carols from David's dashboard scribbled across the cold air. Hocking Hills lay a couple of hours south, and the interstate was the same gray ribbon I've driven since Robert and I took the kids to see Old Man's Cave when they were little. Back then, I kept a basket in the back seat, filled with coloring books, juice boxes, wipes, and the kind of crackers that leave a trail into adulthood. On that old trip, David had fallen asleep with his forehead against the window, his breath fogging the glass, and little Lila had chewed on a plastic giraffe until its ear wore smooth. In the photos from that day, Robert's hair still had a solid streak of black, and my hands looked quick, caught mid-reach, little evidence of what they would hold in the years ahead. I stopped at the Sheets by the highway for coffee that tasted faintly of metal and cinnamon, the kind of coffee I pretend to like on long drives. A young couple in matching winter hats argued near the muffin rack about whether to buy blueberry or corn. He mimed the merits of one with his free hand. She rolled her eyes and laughed, and put both in their basket. I stood by the window, my own hat back on my head, and for the first time that season, I noticed my reflection. A woman with good posture and a mouth that has learned to keep from apologizing for taking up space. I watched an Amish buggy clip south on the road parallel to the highway, the horse steam breathing in the cold, slow and resolute. Every path has its own pace. On the way down, I thought about last Christmas, how the house had peeled itself open to make room for everyone and everything. I had fixed 3 kinds of potatoes because Addie swears mashed are the point of the holiday, and David insists on the rosemary roasted ones I've been making since he came home from college with a girlfriend who knew her herbs. I baked ham and turkey both, even though my doctor tells me to watch the salt. I washed sheets after midnight on the pull-out in the den because Benny had a nosebleed. I read 6 bedtime stories, the last 2 whispered in the dark to kids who weren't even mine to shush. There were moments of sweetness, I won't deny that. The way we all sang Silent Night, off-key and in unison, how Lila's youngest June got frosting on her chin and then fell into me asleep, heavy with trust. But when the door shut on the last goodbye, and I finally turned off the porch light, I leaned on the wall and cried, soundless, the way a body does when it's out of public. In January, I had a flare in my knee that the doctor called overuse, and I nodded as if that word could be a diagnosis for a life. People like to say, but you love it, as if love swallows labor and makes it harmless. Loving my family has never been the question. The question is whether love always requires self-erasure, and if that erasure teaches the people you love to take your time as if it grows on a tree in your backyard. Somewhere along the line, our family fell into a pattern where my work smoothed everyone else's days. When Robert died, I kept the calendar, the casseroles, the comfort blankets. I stepped in when Lila's marriage started wobbling that first spring, when she needed quiet afternoons to sit in the car in the parking lot of the counselor's office and gather herself. When David's HVAC business had a slow quarter and payroll loomed, I sold the baby Grand Robert, and I bought at an auction our 3rd year of marriage and wrote a check without fanfare. I told myself I was honoring my vows to my children, though the vows I actually made were to their father and were about steadiness, not servitude. I am not naive. Women of my generation were given a script. I followed it for a long time because some of it felt true and good, because service is woven into the fabric of my faith, because watching someone eat a meal you made with your hands can feel like holiness. But service without consent is something else, an assumption. A shrug of, she won't say no, spoken into a laundry room that has seen me fold everything from swaddles to soccer jerseys. It wasn't the first straw, but it was the one that made me put down the basket. By the time I turned off onto the smaller road toward the cabin, the landscape had switched to those soft, buckled hills that make southeastern Ohio such a quiet marvel. Hemlocks held snow in their green hems. A hawk took off from a fence post with a motion as decisive as a period at the end of a sentence. The cabin was exactly as advertised in the listing: 2 bedrooms, wood-paneled walls, a gas fireplace that lit with the push of a button, and a porch with 2 rockers that would be perfect in May. They left a little welcome basket on the counter with a jar of jam from AMI Country Store and 2 hot cocoa packets with tiny marshmallows. The fridge hummed the way fridges always hum when the house is otherwise quiet. I put my suitcase on the bed and smoothed the quilt, then stood in the silence and felt something uncurl in that space right under my breastbone where I keep my worry. Peace is not the same as lack of love. It might be its ground. I set the puzzle box on the coffee table and opened the curtains so the winter light could pool on the floor. On the mantel, above the fireplace, someone had placed a small nativity carved from olive wood, the whole scene no bigger than a loaf of bread. I touched the shepherd's head with the tip of one finger, thinking of the years I had organized our church's pageant, pinning bath towels to children's shoulders, and coaxing a nervous Joseph to say, "No room," without dissolving into giggles. The pageant has gone on fine without me the last 2 Decembers. They missed my cookie trays, but not enough to stop. One of the lessons of this age is that almost nothing you think is indispensable actually is. The other lesson is that you are allowed to be needed by yourself. My phone chimed from the kitchen counter where I'd set it down. For a wild second, I thought about not checking it, my thumb hovering over the screen like a trick knee that wants to give. But I had already set my boundaries before I got here, and checking my phone was not my line to draw. I picked it up. There was a text from David, then 2 missed calls, then a message. "Mom? Seriously, we're here. The kids are here. Where did you go? Call me." Then 15 minutes later, an emoji of a thumbs up and the words, "We'll figure it out. Thanks for the warning." Then another, "I can't believe you did this." In my mind, I could see him in the front seat of the minivan, scrubbing at his jaw, turning to Brittany, my daughter-in-law, with that particular shade of frustration that wears disappointment like a feathered hat. Brittany is not the villain here. She has a sharp look sometimes, the kind of glance a woman develops when she's been tasked with smoothing a man's edges and then gets blamed for carrying sandpaper. I remembered the times she had whispered, "Thank you," into my neck while I held a feverish baby. How she once left a bouquet of grocery store tulips on my porch in February when she knew I was missing Robert in a way that turned everything a little sideways. Patterns catch good people like vines. I set the phone down and made myself a cup of cocoa, even though I usually drink tea. I stood by the window and watched the trees hold their ground. When I was a little girl, my mother would say of her own mother, "She gives until she's invisible." I didn't understand then what it meant to disappear in the shape of giving, to be present for every emergency and absent from any conversation about what you might want. When my parents moved us from Toledo to Columbus because Daddy's job at the manufacturing plant got transferred, my mother became the woman who filled all the volunteer slots no one else wanted. She ladled chili at the fall fair, she stapled programs before the school play, and when her own mother broke a hip, she moved Grandma into our front room and slept on the couch for 2 months to be close to her. My mother could accept communion with hands that had arthritis in every knuckle. She also died at 69, 1 year older than I am now, with a look on her face like she'd just thought of something she forgot to tell us. I don't know exactly what it was, but I think part of it was this. Tell them no sometimes so you can say yes with your whole self when it matters. I had let it go on so long that I had taught them to count on the very thing that exhausted me. That doesn't make me a martyr. It makes me a person who ignored her own limits and then blamed other people for crossing them. But David's voice in the laundry room, light, a little conspiratorial, had lifted that blindfold. She won't say no. It wasn't just the words. It was the certainty. That afternoon, I took a walk on the trail behind the cabin. It wasn't strenuous, but the cold slapped a pretty pink into my cheeks and made my knee whisper in that familiar way. The path dipped into a shallow gully and climbed again. I passed a small frozen stream, the surface milky and opaque, the thin water underneath still moving, unstoppable. I thought of all the times I had stopped my life to let someone else's current pull me. If I was going to be the person my grandchildren looked back on and say, "She loved us fiercely and taught us how to set a table and a limit," I had to start now. When I got back, I lit the fireplace, because there is no reason to deny yourself small comforts when you're wrestling with bigger truths. The jigsaw's border went together quickly. The fox's tail, the curve of the birch trunks, the white corners of the scene where the snow had drifted and caught the light. I am not one of those people who rejects help out of hand, who mistakes boundaries for walls. I will always be the woman who keeps ginger snaps in a tin and knows how to find the star ornament someone hid behind the couch cushion in 2003 and never retrieved. I am also a woman who will not allow her love, my love, to be ledgered as a debt. That first evening in the cabin, I sat at the small pine table and wrote a letter to David in my churchwoman's neat print. My hands shook at first, the way they did the first time I drove again after the accident that took Robert in an instant on the bypass when a tractor trailer did not see him in time. My fingers are not as steady as they once were. But my mind took a deep breath and began. Dear David, I will not be available to take all the kids for entire days on a moment's notice anymore. I love you and your family. I love Lila and hers. I'm happy to plan time with each of the grandchildren, and we will continue our traditions, but in ways that keep me healthy and kind. I will say yes when I can offer a true yes, not a tired or scared one, and I will say no when I need to. I went on for a page, writing the kind of letter I wish my mother had written to me, if she'd dared. I named the things I had done because it is good for people to see labor, not to score points, but to tell the truth. The late nights, the school pickups, the winter mornings spent blowing on tiny fingers to warm them. I named the ways he and Brittany had shown me love too, because relationships are not one-sided coins. I ended with a plan, a rotating Sunday supper, once a month, each family sharing cooking and cleanup. One night a week, 2 hours, when I could have 1 or 2 grandkids at a time, to read, bake, walk. If a real emergency comes, I will be there. If it's poor planning, I will not. I put the letter in an envelope and placed it in my purse. I would hand it to him when the house had settled from Christmas, when the sting had gone out of his cheeks. He will be angry at first because anger is easier to hold than the feeling that goes under it. There will be a heavier conversation. That is the conflict I am walking toward. I am not proud of avoiding it for so long that it must be had now in the shadow of a nativity scene. But here we are. The night wrapped itself around the cabin like a blanket. I made myself a simple dinner. Tomato soup from a can. A slice of bread with butter I left out until it spread without tearing. It felt like college again, and widowhood's first months, and something else too, a tiny rebellion stitched with thread you can barely see. I found a station on the radio that played old standards and hummed along with Ella Fitzgerald while snow started a new soft layer on the porch. I've seen the hardest parts of my life in winter. A husband buried, a diagnosis I feared that turned out to be a false alarm, a son who forgot to think of me as a person for a minute in a laundry room and taught me how to remember myself. I've also seen miracles. June born after Lila thought she might not carry to term, the look on my father's face when the union negotiated safer terms for the men on third shift, the time the church raised enough at the bake sale to repair Mr. Norris's wheelchair ramp before his home health aide quit. My life is an ordinary one in Ohio, filled with pantry staples and ironed dresses, with a Buick idling and a minivan blasting Feliz Navidad on repeat, with Buckeye's chocolate on a tray and that white crocheted snowflake my friend Evelyn makes every year and hands to me at coffee hour with a wink. Evelyn called me mid-morning the next day, her voice on the landline at the cabin because she knows I do not answer my cell when I say I'm away. Robert and I used to joke that she can sniff out a story before it has a plot, and she proved it again. "You did it," she said without preamble, and I could hear the choir rehearsal warming up in the background, the gentle clatter of hymnals being stacked. "I could tell when you didn't pick up Wednesday night that you might be living dangerously." "I didn't want to talk myself out of it," I replied, pouring coffee into the mug with the deer on it the cabin provided. "Good," she said. "You know I'll love you either way, but I like you better this way. I'm already praying for the fallout." "Pray for kindness," I told her, "for all of us." We talked about the special music planned for Christmas Eve, the way Pastor Larson had decided to keep the sermon short because the storm was coming and he wanted people home before the roads glazed. Evelyn told me that Mr. Melton, who never misses, had learned to live stream from his granddaughter and would watch in his slippers if the ice got bad. It felt good, all that ordinary. It held me like a familiar coat. Later, when I drove into town, if you can call 2 streets, a post office, and a cafe a town, there was a line at the counter for hot chocolate and cinnamon rolls. I bought 1 roll and tore it with my fingers, feeling the sugar grit and the warmth cut through the December air. A woman about my age sat down on the stool next to mine and sighed in the universal way a grandmother sighs when she sits. The arch of her foot was traceable in the way she set it down, carefully. "Big week?" she asked, the way Midwesterners do when they're willing to talk or not, depending on your answer. "You have no idea," I said, then smiled so she would know I wasn't inviting a confessional at the counter. She nodded and tugged at her scarf. "Family," she said. It was a complete sentence. "Family," I agreed, and we both laughed softly in our cups. At the cabin, the second evening was easier. I finished the puzzle. Last piece was the tip of the fox's ear, it always seems to be. That small satisfaction that comes when you fit something you thought you'd lost. I let the radio play low. I read the story of the angel appearing to Mary and thought about how often Scripture starts with fear and moves through it. Fear is not a stop sign. It is a caution signal. There is still a road. I will not pretend the guilt did not come back, padding to my bed at 2 a.m. like a child who couldn't sleep. What kind of grandmother cancels Christmas? I answered myself in the quiet. The kind who understands that letting your son see the edges of your humanity is a gift, too. The kind who wants him to lead his own family without a safety net that has begun to fray. The kind who knows that if she keeps saying yes to being used, she will turn resentment into a tradition as sturdy as the stockings, and that resentment will seep into her voice when her grandchildren ask for more cocoa, and they will grow up thinking it was about them when it was about her cowardice. I slept and woke and slept and woke, the night making its slow way toward morning. When I got up, the world had been frosted. The porch looked like a cake left out in the yard. I stood with my coffee and watched a deer step carefully through the trees, her body an elegant line, her ears flicking at sounds I could not hear. Once, when David was 2 and full of the kind of light little boys have, he sat in the cart at the Kroger and reached for a box of cereal with a frog on it. He turned to me and said, "Seriously? Do frogs eat this?" And I laughed so hard the whole aisle smiled. I can bear a complicated picture of him. My son is still that boy. He is also a man who thinks he can hand me a task like 9 children in a house and call it love. We will talk about the difference. I know what people say. At least they want to be with you. Yes. And I want to be with them too, in a way that doesn't wring me out. You'll miss these days when they're gone. I will miss some of these days. I will not miss being so tired that joy pinches. There is a proportion to things. I have come late to learning mine, but late is still in the race. On Christmas Eve, I drove to the little white church down the road from the cabin. It wasn't my church, but the hymnal was the same blue, and the greeters at the door had the same cross-stitched name tags my fingers have made for our narthex. The sanctuary smelled like wax and pine. A handful of children in red sweaters clustered at the front, practicing their cues. A man with a voice like a solid oak table read from Luke. When we lit our candles and sang Silent Night, the flame trembled in the draft, and I cupped my hand around it and thought of all the small flickers I've tried to protect in this life. The light held. After the service, I lingered in the parking lot under a sky so clear the stars looked pinned on. I checked my phone. A text from Lila blinked up, sent an hour before. "Mom, I heard what happened. I'll call after the kids are asleep. Are you okay?" I typed back, "I'm okay. Enjoy tonight. We can talk in a couple days." There were other messages too. Two from Brittany, polite but stiff. The kids were disappointed. We told them we'd have our own morning and it's going to be special. Hope you're well. A longer one from David that started with, "I was wrong to assume," and ended with, "We need to talk." It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a crack in that certainty. I felt the tightness in my chest loosen a notch. I put the phone back in my coat pocket and watched my breath cloud and drift away, temporary and true. On Christmas morning, I watched the sun come up from the rocker on the porch, wrapped in an old quilt. Across the way, the woods were new again. I thought of the chaos and the wrapping paper storms that would be happening in living rooms all over Ohio, the paper crowns from the party crackers askew on heads, the smell of bacon and coffee weaving through houses like smoke. I thought of my own house, the lights on a timer clicking to festive all by themselves, the ham in the freezer waiting for another day. I thought of my mother and my grandmother and the ways our Christmases had been stitched together by the women who cooked them and cleaned them and kept them going, even when they wanted to put their feet up and take a breath. I had a breath now. I had a whole morning of them. I ate toast with the jam from the basket and read a novel without checking the time. I cried for a minute, quietly, not sad so much as relieved and scared and grateful, all folded together like layers of a cake you can't cut without seeing all the stripes. I prayed, not for forgiveness, because I did not need it, but for wisdom, for steady words when the conversation came, for David's heart to be soft and his ears to be open and his jaw unclenched. I prayed for Brittany to feel seen instead of blamed. I prayed for Lila to trust that she doesn't have to make peace for everyone, a habit she took on at 9 when her father and brother had one of their loud discussions about a science project that went wrong and I could not find the glue. In the afternoon, I drove to Old Man's Cave and walked the accessible loop trail because that is what my knee allows. The air in the gorge has its own smell, ancient and damp, like books in a quiet library. I leaned against the rail and watched the water where it wasn't frozen slide under sheets of ice, catching light and slipping away. A young man proposed at the overlook. He went to one knee and held out a ring, and the girl with him put her hands to her mouth and nodded so vigorously her hat almost tipped. People cheered. It felt good to be part of their moment without duty attached, to clap and then keep walking, a witness instead of a worker. A flock of starlings turned over our heads like a handful of tossed coins and moved on. When I got back to the cabin, I thought about calling David. I stood there with the handset in my palm and listened to the dial tone as if it could tell me what to say. Then I set it down. Tomorrow, the day after. After their day was their day. One of the small revolutions of this week is letting the people you love live their own holidays and messes without weaving myself into every thread. I made a bowl of chili from a can, Mrs. Raines would disapprove, and watched the snow pile deeper on the deck. I made a list. In my old teacher's way, I divided it with a line down the middle. On one side, I wrote, "The things I have gladly done and will gladly keep doing." On the other side, "The things I have done from fear." The first list is longer. Tying shoes, rocking babies, showing up in bleachers when it's below freezing and someone blows into his hands and takes a swing. Stirring gravy with the patience of a saint. Listening to the story of a third-grade argument as if it is world news. On the other side, driving across town in sleet because a last-minute date popped up. Keeping children while adults went to a store's grand opening, as if free samples were an emergency. Paying a utility bill when a grown man did not want to make a phone call. I am not condemning anyone. I am sorting my life. By the time I packed to go home, the knot between my shoulder blades had loosened so much I could reach back and touch it with surprise. The drive north was bright and cold, the road crews having done their good work with salt and sand overnight. I pulled into my driveway to find the inflatable Santa upright for once, and the snow around my front stoop clean, shoveled by Mr. Nguyen next door, who does not speak much because his English is new, and my Vietnamese is non-existent, but who shows up with a shovel after every storm like we are kin. A card was wedged in my storm door from the church seniors group, a cartoon of a robin with a scarf, and a note from the committee chair reminding me of the January potluck and asking if I could bring my scalloped corn. I smiled. Help is still somewhere on the calendar. It just will not be constant. The house smelled like itself. The timer had kept the lights honest. The ham in the freezer was as patient as ham can be. I set my purse on the hall table and walked through the rooms, touching the back of the chair where Robert used to toss his jacket, the corner of the kitchen counter worn smooth by elbows and newspapers and after-dinner talk. There are ghosts here, but they're friendly. I made tea. I put on the kettle like a person who believes the future will keep boiling. At noon, the doorbell rang. I knew it would. When I opened the door, David stood there, hat in his hands, looking like the boy who asked about frog cereal, all grown and trying to be humble. I stepped back and let him in. He stood in the hallway and turned the hat in his hands as if it were his apology and he needed help finding the edges. "Mom," he said. It came out small. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, because hot drinks make hard words easier. He nodded. We sat at the table that has held birthday cakes and bills and the clipboard where I once kept track of piano practice. He looked at the envelope I placed between us, my handwriting neat and relentless, and he looked at me. The conversation we needed to have opened like a season. We would talk about holidays. We would talk about help. We would talk about the sentence, "She won't say no," and how we write a new one together. He would sputter some, and I would steady my voice. And somewhere in the middle, we would love each other honestly, which is harder and better than loving by habit. When he reached for the envelope, I put my hand over his for a second, the way mothers do. A little pressure that says, "I am here. I am not going anywhere," I told him. "I am changing the terms." He nodded and swallowed, and then, to my surprise, laughed a little, a laugh without edges. "Brittany says she married me because I have a generous mother," he said. "She also says I married her because she tells me the truth. She has good instincts," I replied. He took a breath. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice caught on the R. "I took you for granted. I didn't think about you. I thought about logistics." "Logistics matter," I said. "So do people." We sat there, two people with matching hands and a long history, and unfolded our maps. The boundary lines on them were new, but the territory was the same. Love, the old house smell of cinnamon, and a church bell that chimed the hours like a faithful friend. I don't know where every road from this table will go. I do know I will not build another holiday with the brick of resentment and call it a hearth. I will keep Christmas the way I meant to as a girl, when I learned the carols and believed every word, joyfully, clearly, with room for everyone to bring their offerings and not leave them all on my porch. Outside, the widow's lights I hung before this week blinked on, one more reminder that time does not wait. The kettle whistled. The ham could wait. The letter was in his hands. The conversation had begun. And in the center of it all, steady as a star over a small town in Ohio, was a woman who learned how to say a loving no and discovered it made her yes a sweeter thing. I stood at the window of the little cedar cabin and let my eyes rest on the untouched snow. My hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm cocoa, made the real way, with hot milk and marshmallows, not just from water. My suitcase was still half packed on the bed behind me, red and bulky, a relic of all the other Christmas trips in the old station wagon, back when Robert would fuss about gas mileage and Lila would read books in the back with her feet on David's lap. The plastic bin they all expected to climb down from the attic each December, stockings embroidered by my mother, the Santa puzzle with 2 corners chewed by a puppy 30 years gone, sat in my trunk instead, not hung by any chimney at all this year. There was a strange peace in the silence. No thudding boots, no eager voices or the television running endless loops of claymation specials. I allowed myself to breathe, each exhale making room for the idea that this year I really had locked the storm door, set the boundaries, and chosen to honor them. The last 48 hours played again and again in my mind, like the soft hum of the old VCR. That cracked laundry room door, the shock of rubbing cinnamon-scented fingers on a dish towel over and over as my son's voice, my own son who once played shepherd for a baggie of animal crackers, laughed easily about leaving the hard parts to me. Gone in that moment was the little boy who'd come running when he skinned a knee. He'd grown into a man who counted my yes as a household appliance. Reliable, predictable, silent. Humiliation stabbed in my throat and lodged behind my ribs until, just as suddenly, a kind of calm, cool and practical, like stepping down barefoot on kitchen tile in December, settled over me. It wasn't anger that made me imagine a different Christmas. It was clarity. Of all the injuries to absorb, the lonely birthdays after Robert died, the silent admissions of being needed but never quite seen, the last-minute texts that made my stomach clench with equal parts affection and dread, this somehow was the last. I was tired of love being measured by how quickly I could drop my own plans for someone else's crisis. I'd felt it swell every year, this gathering weight. But each time I'd taken up the slack, thinking someday they'd see the cost. Instead, invisibility grew comfortable as an old nightgown. Only now did I realize how threadbare it had become. When I packed for the cabin, I hesitated over one thing. A little wooden snowflake ornament with white paint chipping at the edges. Lila made it at Girl Scouts when she was 9. Her teacher said it was hers to keep or share, but she pressed it into my palm and told me it would help the house stay cozy, even when it's sad. It had hung near the kitchen window for 2 decades, halfway between the living room and my heart. As I zipped the suitcase, I dropped that snowflake in, a symbol that this Christmas I would keep the warmth for myself and finally defend the space to do so. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my best sweater, a silent promise. I would not become invisible, but instead let what mattered show itself. 2 hours south of my old White House, tucked among the hemlocks and stone ledges of Hocking Hills, the cabin was just as the listing described. Simple, sturdy, and quiet enough that I could hear my own thoughts, not just my to-do lists. The first afternoon, I nearly picked up my phone a dozen times. Old instincts die hard. What if Lila's youngest came down with a fever? Would Benny cry at bedtime if it wasn't me tucking him in? And what if David and Brittany, what if they realized Christmas was work, not magic? I left the phone on silent, shoved under a magazine. My hands hovered, restless. I learned to sit still. But then the messages rolled in. David, cycling through confusion, then irritation, finally a bland accommodation. Thanks for the warning. He expected me back for Christmas Eve, maybe Christmas morning at the latest. Brittany, trying kindness, then quiet cold. Lila, guilt over her own reliance on me, then suggestions for future plans, each assuming I'd change my mind. I answered only when I was ready, brief and steady. No apologies. The snowflake in my pocket pressed against my skin, as if asking gently, "Are you sure?" And I was. The old patterns unspooled in my mind as I walked the snowy trail around the cabin, my years of answering every call, the willingness to forfeit my own rest and time, the way I practiced being needed harder than I ever practiced being enough. Each memory had its own sting. David, 4 years old, wailing at midnight for water he refused to get for himself until I'd stumbled from bed. Grateful, always, but never really considering that I'd prefer to sleep through just once. In Lila's teenage years, the slammed doors and crying jags I'd absorbed, ducking my own heartbreak when she left for college by throwing myself into volunteering, casseroles, and the comforting busyness of being the church mom everyone could lean on. The first Christmas after Robert died, I spent 3 hours shoveling the walk before sunrise, just so David and his family could arrive to a clean stoop, and barely got a thank you for it. I let myself remember the humiliations too. The time last winter when David jokingly told his friends at church, "Just ask Mom. She'll always say yes. She doesn't have a life." The way the church ladies would glance at me sympathetically during Bible study, as if they too saw the exhaustion in my cheeks but wouldn't dare say a word. The time I missed my own choir rehearsal because Lila's sitter canceled, and then found out she had spent the afternoon running errands, not at an appointment as she'd told me. The accumulation of these slights was like being nibbled thin by ducks. No single wound fatal, but altogether a hollowing ache. Basta. That word rose in me like a song after so many seasons of silence. I heard it in the crunch of snow under my boots. Enough. I would not be the cushion any longer, not the silent backup plan, not the invisible fixer. The old snowflake ornament grew heavier in my pocket, as if all those years waited for me to finally do the thing my mother never did. Say no, while there was still time to say yes with joy, not obligation. I spent the first full day at the cabin finding my rhythm. I made breakfast, buckwheat pancakes, thick with syrup and a pat of melting butter, reading the old cookbook Mrs. O. Rains had given me at my second Christmas as a widow. I walked down to the frozen creek and watched the world turn blue in late afternoon. I spread my puzzle on the table and fit together the foxes and the birch trunks, a border forming that I promised myself I would not ignore, even when family insisted on crossing it. That night, alone with the nativity on the mantel, I thought of my mother's voice as she'd confessed, too late, the weight of yielding and the sorrow in never demanding grace for herself. I missed her most sharply then, missed what she could have taught me if she dared to be less selfless. I touched the snowflake and whispered aloud to the empty room, "Not me, not anymore," as if my mother's spirit might be listening, nodding in approval. I slept deeply, for the first time in months, and dreamt of nothing that needed fixing. The next morning, I wrote the letter to David, a ritual I approached with trembling hands and a straight back. Words were my tool, not my weapon. Every stroke was forges from love shadowed by fatigue. I named the shape of my care. The late-night drives, the casseroles at the ready, the buckets carried up and down attic stairs, the quiet presence that kept holidays humming, even when no one thought to check if I was humming too. I explained what my new Christmas would be, what boundaries would look like, not as punishment, but as the only way forward that did not twist my love into something small and brittle. The plan coalesced. I would offer a monthly Sunday supper, each family contributing, everyone sharing both preparation and cleanup. I'd welcome grandchildren to my home one at a time for baking, stories, a walk in the park, not as unpaid labor, but precious company. I wrote that real emergencies, true crises, would always bring me running. But I would no longer be the solution to every problem born from someone else's poor planning. I signed the letter with my full name, Margaret Ann Hanlon. It felt correct. This was a decision forged by the woman who had raised 2 children and buried a husband, who had endured humiliation and come out standing, who knew at last that her own limits were worthy of defense. With the letter tucked in my purse, the snowflake, glimmering white, imperfect and visibly present, became my medal and my reminder. Every time I felt guilt creeping near, I touched it, let my thumb smooth its worn edge, and remembered. Standing up for oneself is not a rejection of family, but a reclamation of soul. Christmas Eve arrived, bright and uniquely quiet. I visited the closest church, a squat white chapel with blue hymnals and waxy window candles. Candles were passed down the aisles in the dark hush, and I sang Silent Night in my own key, not worrying over the pitch. I prayed, not for apology, but for patience, for my children to recognize dignity as a blessing, not a threat. Afterward, I checked messages on my phone. David, confused but admitting, "We need to talk." Brittany, polite but careful. Lila, fretful. I let their grief pass through me, determined not to make it my own. On Christmas morning, I pulled on my coat and boots and walked out through pine and ice and birdsong, everything crisp and generously spare. For the first time in years, I let the day be my own. I read for hours. I baked a single apple crisp, indulgent and fragrant, and ate it while hot. I missed the bustle and the buzz and the children's feet overhead, but I did not miss feeling invisible in their midst. The symbol of this change, my snowflake, rested at my throat, warm from my own body heat. As I sipped coffee on the porch, I traced it again, thankful for the decision that this year, Christmas, would not be an act of self-erasure. The conversations would come, awkward and necessary, but for now, under a cold, clear Ohio sky, I was finally myself. The next day, I returned home to my house on Sycamore Lane, lights twinkling on their timer, air heavy with the spices of holidays past. I set my purse and the letter by the door, rested the ornament on my kitchen windowsill, and turned on the kettle. I thought of the years I spent giving every last ounce, and all the silent prayers I'd sent up for strength instead of permission. As the clock chimed noon, the doorbell rang, and I knew David waited on the other side, uncertain as a boy with a birthday gift too small for the box. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and old forgivenesses. I let him in, offered him tea, and set the letter on the table between us, the symbol, the truth, the terms all visible. The conversation was not easy. He bristled, argued, fumbled for logic. We need you. And the kids. Christmas. It's not the same. But I held my ground, my palm flat atop the letter, my fingers brushing the snowflake at my heart. David, I said steadily, I want to be part of your lives and your holidays, but not at the cost of myself. Not anymore. This isn't just for me. It's for all of us. A better way, where love does not leave anyone hollow. He was silent for a long time. I watched him see not just his mother, but a person, a woman full of limits and longing, and an old dignity he'd mistaken for simplicity. Something in him softened, whether from memory or clarity or the humble weight of my words. He reached out, hands big and awkward as a boy's, and for the first time in many years, held mine not for comfort, but in respect. I'm sorry, Mom, he said. I really am. We sat in the warmth, the kettle hissing, the letter between us, and I knew the old ways would not return. The pattern had been broken, the boundary drawn. My snowflake caught the afternoon light, a reminder that this year, and from now on, my Christmas would belong to me, whole and true, and every yes I offered would be a gift, no longer an obligation. In that simple, ordinary room, amid bells, tea, and love hard-won, I claimed my peace, and it shined as bright and steady as any star in the winter Ohio sky. I pressed my fingertips against the kitchen counter, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my palms, even as the rest of the house cooled around me. With each breath, the familiar scents of cinnamon, pine, and memories brewed deeper than coffee itself. My suitcase, half unpacked on the bench, was proof that I hadn't run away this Christmas, only reclaimed it. I turned the little wooden snowflake over in my hand. Lila's childish painting still visible around the edges, white on wood, stark as a truth spoken at last. The morning after David's visit, the world outside looked unchanged. Snow crisp on the porch railings, my neighbor's shovel marks clean and patient along my walk. But the air inside my heart was lighter, as if a window left cracked had finally let out decades of weather too heavy to carry. I watched water roll and shimmer in the kettle's belly, the rising steam catching that spot of colored sunlight from the curtain. The house was silent, holding its peace not like an ache, but a blessing. It wasn't just that David had apologized, though there was healing in his voice when he did. All tumble and stops and starts, the way confessions go in families like ours. It was that he'd sat long enough to listen, not for an opening to argue, but to understand. In those quiet moments after, he read the letter, his thumb sweeping the edge as if he could smooth away what couldn't be unsaid. I let him take his time. Sometimes, love is giving space without rushing to fill it. He asked questions haltingly. Do you really mean less? And I told him what I'd practiced saying in the cabin's hush. Not less, David, just not at the price of disappearing. I want my presence to be a choice, not an emergency plan. He started to argue, old grooves, deep and reflexive. But then he looked at me, saw the steadiness there, and settled instead for honesty. Mom, it's always been the way we do it. You make everything work, even when it shouldn't, he said, voice trembling. In that moment, I saw not the man with 9 kids crowding my porch, but the boy who'd once wet the bed and sobbed from shame, rescued only when I sat beside him and said, "There's nothing here for you to hide." That's what I offered my grown son now, not condemnation, but understanding. "We can learn something new," I replied. By the time he left, the letter was tucked in his coat pocket, and my hands felt cleaner than any number of scrubbings could manage. I watched through the front window as he walked through the crusted snow, head bent, pausing before he reached his car. He turned back once and lifted a hand. A small wave, maybe a question, mostly a promise. The first days after, I expected regret to arrive like snowmelt under the door, softening my resolve. Instead, I felt only relief, sharp at first, then radiant. Each message from the family that trickled in was brief, searching for the old ground rules, checking if I'd slipped back into the yes woman's shoes. I held steady, short answers, firm boundaries, invitations for new traditions. When Lila called, her voice was raw with apology. "Mom, I should have helped more. I'm so sorry." I let her speak, heard the sob in her smile, and told her what I now believed down to the marrow. "It's not about blame, Lila. It's about balance. We get to change." I invited her over for coffee the next Saturday. No children, just the 2 of us, and a kitchen table crowded only with sunlight and mugs. We talked like grown women. No rescue or cover-up, just the unfurling of truth. She pressed my hand and said, "I want June to learn how to say a real no. I want her to know that's love too." My eyes stung at that. We let the silence settle, gentle as dust. Words spread gently, as changes do in a family where tradition is stitched from years of routine. My little house did not fill with grandchildren that week, nor did the empty space ache the way I imagined it might. Instead, I dusted for myself, played music I liked, chose soup over ham, and looked at the old photographs without wishing for rescues. Church friends started asking gentle questions. I answered them with laughter and candor, proud in the rare, polite way you get at my age when you've survived the weathering of being needed above all. The snowflake ornament watched from its sunlit spot over the kitchen sink, a sentinel for a new kind of peace. With every dish washed and set in the rack, I told myself the same truth. Boundaries are not barriers, but bridges. My grandchildren called in pairs, shy at first, then silly. They told me about the Christmas morning at home, how their dad burned the cinnamon rolls. "Not as good as yours, Grandma." And Brittany laughed so hard she nearly cried. "We made a mess. We missed you," Benny said, "but we made it on our own." The pride in his voice, new, uncertain, but growing, was another melody in the house, softer and sweeter than any carol. A week later, we gathered for that first new Sunday supper. Not all at once. There were shoes in the hall, laughter in the living room, and a sense that something old had cracked, but not broken. We brought dishes to share: Lila's shepherd's pie, David's hesitant green beans, Brittany's cherry cobbler. The children set the table, bickering but not fighting, practicing what it meant to contribute. I watched without rescuing, only offering when asked. When supper was done, they cleared the plates together, a chaos of elbows and dish towels, and somehow managed to leave the kitchen cleaner than they'd inherited it. Afterward, while the adults lingered with coffee and the children sprawled under the lit tree, David found me in the quiet. "You meant what you wrote," he said. Not as a question, but a dawning respect. I nodded. He didn't say sorry again. Instead, he thanked me. Not for the years of invisible labor, but for teaching him how to stand on his own. I want my kids to know how to host too. I want them to remember this part, not just the presents. I smiled and hooked my thumb around the snowflake at my neck. They'll remember the warmth, David. If we're lucky, maybe even the hard part that made us better. He squeezed my shoulder, sheepish and proud. Lila pressed a mug into my hands and asked for the recipe for the buckwheat pancakes. We laughed, remembering how many mornings those pancakes had rescued us all, from school day grumps, from heartache, from plain old bad weather. As weeks rolled into months, the new pattern held. Each family took turns hosting dinner. Sometimes it went well. Other times, chaos reigned. But I was not the safety net anymore, nor the sacrificial lamb in an apron. I made time for puzzles with Leah, knitting with Addie, slow walks with June. Each yes felt deliberate, a gift, not a surrender. I went back to the library, taking hours to myself that didn't need justification or apology. I kept my standing baking night with Evelyn, whose winks got sharper and kinder, and let the choir find its own way without my need to organize every carol. I even said no when they asked me to chair the spring rummage sale without excuse or guilt. A woman at church, 2 years my junior and worn thin around the eyes, grabbed my arm as I left the sanctuary one Sunday. "How did you do it, Maggie?" she whispered. "How did you finally say enough?" I squeezed her hand, warm and certain. "Find your own snowflake," I said softly, and we smiled through tears. Winter melted, not quickly but surely, and with the thaw came joy not shadowed by debt or fatigue. David brought the children for afternoons, sometimes not all at once, and I delighted in the way they discovered conversation without competition. We baked ginger cookies, spilled flour everywhere, told stories around the puzzle table. I returned to the cabin once in the new spring, this time for no reason other than to watch the redbuds bloom over the creek, their quiet color unfurling against gray bark. I took the snowflake ornament, now chipped in 2 places, and hung it from a branch outside the porch. There it spun in soft wind, white against the promise of new leaves, a tiny, twirling mark of all I'd learned and all I hoped to pass on. Presence, perseverance, and the quiet, radiant power of boundaries honored with love. The family grew into their new ways, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with grace. I forgave myself for all the years I gave too much and for each time I might still slip. Lila called one night, proud of a hard-earned no she'd managed at work. "It gets easier, doesn't it?" she asked. And I told her it does, in small, steady steps, one season at a time. Holidays arrived in fresh shapes, sometimes full and bright, sometimes quiet and meaningful, but always honest. The children outgrew their boots. The old station wagon was finally donated to the church outreach program, its stories replaced by laughter in newer cars, by memories no longer weighted by obligation. Through it all, the snowflake hung quiet by my kitchen window, catching dusk light and shimmering above the sink. It was no longer just a relic of Lila's childhood, but the shorthand for a promise to myself, and, more importantly, a legacy for my family. Love, after all, is measured not in how much you give until you vanish, but in how clearly you show up, whole and willing, teaching by example that saying no can be a sacred act. Now when December comes and the first carol hums on the radio, I pour 2 mugs of cocoa, one deep and creamy for me, the other for a visitor, child, or friend, and run my thumb over the ridges of the snowflake. I light the tree because it pleases me. I open the storm door when I want, knowing my Christmas belongs to me, and that each invitation I extend is an offering from a soul no longer at war with scarcity. To anyone listening, reading, or wondering if your love matters less when you draw a line instead of erasing yourself, I promise you, the boundaries you honor are acts of hope for the ones you love. If my story gives you courage or comfort, I hope you'll let me know in the comments or share a memory of your own. And if you found a way to say a loving no that made your yes sweeter, please subscribe and join this little circle of light. There is more to tell, and I want to hear your story too. After all, every winter is just waiting for that small, shimmering snowflake, a sign that someone dared to love themselves whole and taught others the miracle of being seen.